So I'm joined today with Nick Breeding, and we're going to look at gluten-free brewing, some tips and techniques. The level of intolerance out there in the modern world is showing that there's clearly a need for some of these beers being produced that are gluten-free and free from. So Nick, if you could take us through how Murphy's can help with that process, I suppose.
Yes, of course. Yes, you're right. It has become a major subject these days. So you see a lot of it in all sorts of foods now, free from various things, and the consumer is much more increasingly aware of what and wants to know what's gone into the beer. Well, gluten-free, I mean, you can do it without doing very much at all if you produce beer from cereals that don't have gluten in them. And the one that's very well known is sorghum, which is a grain coming from Africa, and that's where they do a lot of beer brewing there, because of course malting barley doesn't grow in Africa, and so they have to use other cereal sources for the sugar, and sorghum is a big source there, and there's no gluten in that. So you could make a beer from sorghum, it wouldn't have any gluten in it at all, you wouldn't need to worry about anything. But of course, it is quite possible to make gluten-free beers from the normal recipes that brewers are currently using, and it begins with using a very well-modified barley, where the enzymes in the malt during the malting process have broken down much of the protein and the starch already, and then the brewer just continues that process in the mashing process in the brew house. That's probably the first point. The second place where he can do a lot to eliminate or significantly reduce gluten to a safe level is by having a very vigorous and strong boil in the brew house. Up to 10% evaporation, a very turbulent physical rolling boil where the gluten is smashed up literally by the physical shear forces created by boiling wort at 100 degrees C. This will invariably yield a low gluten result. However, of course, and the use of kettle finings, carrageenan added at the end of wort boiling, will help to break out quite a bit of the protein which is associated, in the myelopectin, which is associated with gluten, as cold break in the fermenter when he comes to collect the wort. I think, but many brewers now realise that to be absolutely safe, you can add a little enzyme, which is a perfectly natural enzyme. It comes from a fungal organism called Aspergillus niger. It's a very, very specific enzyme for the reducing protein chill haze. It was developed many years ago by DSM in Holland, and it was designed for eliminating the need for refrigerating lager beers after fermentation. It has a side activity where it also reduces gluten, and this is very useful for brewers who want to make a gluten-free beer. It's added at the start of the fermentation. It removes the proline group, which is an amino acid, off the peptide molecule, which is would otherwise combine and polymerize in cold beer and form haze. The proline is absorbed by the yeast during the yeast growth phase, the lag phase in the start of fermentation, and so there's no proline sort of amino acids to come together and form a big peptide as a haze downstream. The side effect is gluten reduction at the same time. So it's important though, because the current law stands 20 ppm is the European Union legislation limit for anything less than 20 ppm can be labelled gluten-free. So it's not quite gluten-free, it's very small amounts of gluten, but for people who are sensitive to it, that's acceptable. That is an acceptable level, 20 ppm. And of course, now, although we're now outside the European Union in the UK, we have adopted that legislation and just carried it over into our new statutes. It's 10 ppm if you're in America. If you want to export your beer to the States, it has to be less than 10 ppm, which is almost immeasurable and almost really is gluten-free. And you have to get each batch tested. It's not sufficient to be able to say, oh, I've added the enzyme, I've added the carrageenan, I've had a really good boil in the brew house. you do need to have each batch has to be tested by a accredited laboratory. And that's where Murphy's can help, because we also sell the carrageenan and the enzyme, and we can do the technical support to the brewer to help him just find the correct dose rate, the moment of addition, etc. But we also do the gluten-free test, and you will get a certificate or a result which you can use as a defense or as a
as part of your HACCP or your BRC
yes, exactly.
or whatever.
As part of that, as part of your accredited your quality control procedures to state that yes, you can label this beer gluten-free.
Yeah. And in relation to dosage rates, is there a one-size-fits-all approach, or is it defined by the grist ratio? Or
correct, it is. It's not one-size-fits-all. It is determined by strength of beer, by the quality of the malt, by the operation, the style of the brewery. Generally, pale ales, lagers, pilsners, anything up to about 3.7% ABV would require between 0.5 and 1.5 grams per hectoliter. So a very small dose rate, very low dose rate, which is good because the enzyme is not cheap. Yeah. But that's all you need to add to achieve both the chill proofing effect and the gluten-free result in final beer. Stronger beers with a higher hopping rate and higher original gravity, so you're up to about 5% ABV, you'd probably need to be between 1 and 3 grams per hectoliter, so a little bit more added to achieve the same result.
Is it usable at a homebrew level? We get asked this a lot. So obviously we work a lot with commercial brewers, but we have a big e-commerce homebrew presence as well. And I know a lot of homebrewers view the video, so is it possible for us to repack it into smaller quantities for them to use?
Yes, you could repack it. The enzyme has it's one of these, like all enzymes are proteins, and as such they have an activity, and this will decline over time. As we sell it, it has a 6-month shelf life. Yeah. But we advise customers, of course, these things don't suddenly stop working after 6 months. Yeah. They just lose their activity, and the general rule of thumb is for every month beyond its use-by date on the label, on the package, increase the dose rate by 10%.
Okay.
So, and then whilst it's not being in use, you keep it tightly shut, keep it in a refrigerator, 6 degrees C, classic sort of fridge temperature. Then you'll get quite a long use out of it. But I think on a home brew system, I would have a look at first, not using the enzyme. I would look at, they could probably achieve a really strong boil, and using kettle finings, they could probably find that they could achieve gluten-free results just through the processing and good quality raw materials. We did a survey, oh gosh, when was it? 15, 16 years ago, of a huge number of beers from the UK and in Europe. And this is well before Brewers Clarets came onto the market. These beers were all gluten-free.
Okay.
And we repeated the test sort of a couple of months later, and they were still gluten-free. The trouble is, you never know when you suddenly might, because of the way malt is a natural product, you might suddenly get a batch that has a higher level, and you won't know that because it's not included on a maltster's specification. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you might find it is higher than the allowed legislation limits. So yes, I think you can, most beers probably already are well brewed beers with good quality raw materials are already gluten-free, but you need to have it tested each time. You can't just rely on that fact.
The testing process is as simple as sending filling out a submission form, which is available online, and sending a sample, posting it here, and then a few days before you get the result?
It's a 5-day turnaround test. We can do a 24-hour turnaround test, for it's a bit more expensive, so you get a result in 24 hours. But yes, 5 days. And you just need 1 can, 440ml can, or a 330ml can, or a 500ml bottle. Yeah. Just wrap it up, secure packaging, maybe send 2 in case 1 breaks.
Yeah.
Sampled from the process at the end of fermentation before you commit to packaging, because it has happened. People package it, then send a sample, and they've already labeled it gluten-free, and it's not gluten-free. It's very rare, but it does happen. And then if you've got several thousand bottles which are already gluten-free,
it's a headache to do a
bit of a headache to do a recall. So, and you will have time between the end of the fermentation, when the yeast has stopped working. The beer is essentially rough beer. It won't change after that. take a couple of samples, bottle them, package them up, send them off, and by the time you get the result back, 5 days later, you will then have a result and help you guide you in your decision as to how to package that tank.
Okay.